Welcome everyone. Welcome to the April pre-webinar. I hope you're all really well. Tonight we've got a bit of a change of pattern. Normally we do a sort of standard webinar with slides and presentation, but tonight we're kind of doing more like off-piste skiing and seeing where our conversation will go, kind of more podcast style. So I'd like to introduce Kylene. Kylene and I have been sort of batting emails back and forth across the Atlantic for a few years now, and we've never actually met, but that's kind of the modern world. One day you'll come over for your Scottish holiday, or I'll make it out to the States again and we'll get together. But Kylene really, really interests me in the way that she works. She's a dietitian and a functional medicine practitioner. And the two aren't really a regular mix. So what we're going to do tonight is explore Kylene's way of working and also explore her professional day job as a basketball nutritionist. And before we go into that, I'll just do the usual kind of introduction to the webinar. I'd like to know where you are in the world, where you're dialing in from, what you do, and what your interest in tonight's webinar is. Now, because it's free-flowing, there's even more potential for interaction than usual. So please pop down your questions. We've got the chat box. Thanks, David, for starting us off. So get familiar with the chat box, and any questions that come up that you'd like to ask Kylene, just pop them in there. If I think it's a good question at the time, I'll bring it into the conversation. Otherwise, we'll do a kind of 40, 45 minutes as usual, and then a 15-minute Q&A as well. And we'll aim to finish within the hour. So we've still got a few people coming into the meeting. Kylene, I would like to ask you the first question. So we get dietitian in your bio, and we get functional medicine in your bio, and that's not a mix that we often see. So let's go there. Tell people a bit about your background and how you got into the functional practice.
Sure. So I'll do my best to make a long story short, but I've been a dietitian since day one of my career, but I was conventionally trained, right? The old school counting calories, which you might imagine. At least that's how we roll here in the United States. That's traditional dietetics programs, which is great. But I kind of got to the point in my career, probably, I don't know, 5 years in, 8 years in, maybe, where I realized a lot of the best athletes in the United States, at least, we're not necessarily working with dietitians, which was a little confusing because I thought, hey, we're supposed to be the experts here. We're the ones that go through all this advanced training. Like, why are they looking outside of our box? And then fast forward a little bit, I was working at Cleveland Clinic at that time, outpatient Cleveland Clinic, general, just basic sports nutrition. And Dr. Mark Hyman came at that time and started the first ever functional medicine institute in a hospital-based setting. I thought, this is interesting. And he had worked with many incredible professional athletes. And I was just curious, what is this about? This is very foreign to me. I interviewed for the heck of it, got the job, honestly knew absolutely nothing, was very overwhelmed, but I slowly began to learn that it just made sense. All these light bulbs went off. Why wouldn't we look at each athlete, as their own individual person? We're also biologically unique. And then here we are with a 3,000 patient wait list at that time. It was unbelievable what I learned, what I saw, what I experienced. And I thought, my basic background is sports. Why would I not mold these two worlds? It only makes sense. If anything, the athletic population needs this type of support more than any other in some ways. And that's kind of how I came to be. And now I'm working full-time in the NBA and also full-time private practice, functional nutrition.
So just reflect for a moment on some things you learned from the Cleveland Clinic. What did you, I know you have your own practice now, but what did you take away from the Cleveland Clinic as kind of strengths in your bow, so to speak?
Well, sure. Well, for sure, the clinical side of things. Like, yes, sports is my love, and that was always the foundation, but having that deeply rooted clinical experience and learning from a team of brilliant physicians that were right there at my fingertips. It wasn't just Mark Hyman. There were plenty at that time. And and knowing what to do, not just for basic recovery, but if someone has a severe autoimmune condition, or if they're an oncology patient, or severe IBS, irritable bowel, all these issues. So kind of learning how to take that deep, because people came from all over the world to us at the Cleveland Clinic, the sickest of the sick. And many were coming for that functional medicine approach because they had gone everywhere. They had come everywhere. They had spent thousands of dollars and gotten nowhere. So almost having to just burn right through that. The turnover was fast, which was difficult, but seeing the extreme illness and learning that clinical foundation is what I think it was irreplaceable.
And are you starting to see more dietitians going into the functional space? Is that a trend that's starting to happen?
Yes, because I think a lot of people are seeing what I saw. Like, this just makes sense. This isn't voodoo. This isn't craziness. This is perhaps the way we should have been practicing this whole time.
Yeah, I saw that in South Africa. I was seeing more and more dietitians going to functional medicine conferences and then genetics conferences and, looking outside the box. So yeah, I think it is a nice pattern that we're starting to see. So let's talk about basketball. You're an ex-track athlete, right? What was your sport?
Yes. 100 meter, 200 meter, short as you could make it.
Excellent. So why basketball? What got you into basketball?
To be honest, it's just most enjoyable for me to watch, to be a part of. Just culturally, I loved the personalities. Cleveland, the Cavs, was my hometown team growing up. So this is legitimately a dream job, not just to work in professional sports, but there's truly nowhere else I would rather be than my hometown team. And just speaking from a lot of experience doing this for about 12 years, management in the space of basketball, at least in our city, is incredible. So incredibly supportive and progressive in terms of nutrition that it just, I don't know, it just felt like the right fit. And I'm going into my 7th season pretty soon here, hopefully.
Wow. And how do you fit that between, you've got your own clinic and then presumably you're traveling quite a lot. How do you balance that? Plus you got a child as well,
right?
in the mix
One
of
on the
it.
way next month, coming out next month, right?
And second
Right.
one on its way.
Right. So I'm certainly not going to say I have the best work-life balance, although I really do try. So I started full-time private practice, kind of part-time Cavs as a consultant, just to see where my place was and if there was a need for this. And then it developed into a full-time role with the Cavaliers, which has been amazing. So luckily I have a team of awesome dietitians. One dietitian, Abby, that's been with us for a while, and one that we're hiring on right now that kind of control everything and do a phenomenal job so that I can be with the team when we're in season.
So what does a sample day look like within basketball camp?
Sure. So come in, and so backtrack a little bit. I mentioned that management has been so supportive and so amazing. They built me this awesome smoothie bar, brand new this season, the center of everything. So it's changed the game of who comes to have conversations, who feels more comfortable asking for a supplement or a smoothie, or about their bowel habits that day, right? Everyone jokes that's all you talk about is bowel habits, but it is the foundation of so much of what we do, right? So having that, right, I go to my station and I get everyone ready for the morning, right? One player might have his usual greens powder. One might want an energy filled smoothie. One may need a supplement regimen. So I get everything ready. And then before they get on the court for the day, sometimes I'll even meet with staff too. I actually handle everything for the whole building because why not? Everyone deserves a chance at the functional approach. And then, right, your usual stuff, right? Checking emails. I check in with our chefs. We have an awesome team of chefs. I am then often reaching out to the personal chefs. So we have a handful of chefs in the building all day, every day, cooking fresh breakfast and lunch snacks. But then outside of that, many of our players have their own chefs at home. So I'm checking in at least a few times a week. How are things going? What's new? What's not going well? How can I support you? And then when the guys come off the court, I'm blending an individually created smoothie for each guy, right? Easy to do when you have a smaller roster. I realize this isn't necessarily the case if you work in the NFL or similar sports. I'll meet with players, just quick touch, grab and go, maybe when they're on a treatment table or when they come in to eat. And then it's usually off to private practice for the night.
So Paul's just asked a question, which you may or may not be able to answer. by the sounds of it, there's a lot of money in the professional sport, both within the organization and what the players are being paid, so they can afford private chefs and the likes.
Sure.
Paul's asking, do you have any knowledge of what happens in Europe or in the UK in sort of team sports, if there's any differences? Have you come across that?
Unfortunately, I can't speak to that. I'm really not sure.
Yeah. I think the budget thing would be an interesting one. I know we have somebody I have worked with who, yes, he's on. I'll maybe pick on you later, Sebastian, who works for a basketball team in Europe. So he'll maybe be able to answer that question for us.
I would actually love to know that answer. So
yeah. So yeah, I mean, it sounds really good. Presumably contractually, the basketball players need to come and see you. Is that right? Or is it a choice?
No, and many of my colleagues and players have said actually overseas, that's often part of the contract, but technically encouraged, but not mandated on this side of the ocean.
Okay. All right. So you're not dealing with players who don't really believe in good nutrition or anything like that. Is everyone who comes to you?
Well, you are, but you're in the same building, you're eating in the same room. It's a little bit easier though to deliver the message, because it's not like I only have one time to meet with them a month where I'm driving home this point. It's just quick little conversations multiple times during the week. So it's a little bit easier to break through for the guys that maybe just, it's not that they don't care, but think about when you were 19. When I was 19, I thought, I'm training all the time, I can eat whatever I want. And many of them feel that way. And I totally understand it, especially if you're still playing well and you don't feel like a complete pile of garbage. It is difficult to try to, encourage the broccoli or, maybe a little more turmeric in that shake. But so the answer to your question is, no, not all of them buy in whatsoever. So it's just a work in progress.
But you can still provide them with a healthy
I have everything
smoothie.
turned off. I have no idea why this is beeping. I'm sorry, what did you say, Ian?
But presumably you can still provide them with a nice smoothie.
Yes, absolutely. And of course, right, getting to know them. What do you love? Do you love tropical? Do you love chocolate covered cherry? I mean, I really work to make this taste good. I'm not trying to serve cat litter, because then no one wants to hear anything you have to say. So just getting to know them. If I know they're going to Chick-fil-A, is like a really well-known fast food restaurant over here, and they love the shakes, they love the chicken. So I might find out if that's what they love, I will have the chef try to replicate a better recipe. Or if I know they love this shake or they love this dessert, I will then take that flavor profile and do my best to blend it into a smoothie. Am I a chef? No, but I've done this long enough to where I'm slowly becoming better at it.
That's great. So you can be inspired by stuff that people like eating and then make it better, which
You have to be relatable to build
which
trust.
is what my wife does as well. There's smoothie bar in South Africa called Kauai, and makes some really good smoothies. But what Rach would do would go and pick one and say, right, this is nice, but how can I make this better? How can I load in the superfoods?
Yes.
And
Yeah, exactly.
yeah, so it's a nice skill to do. So take us through a process. Do you get the opportunity to work deep? If we've got nutritional practitioners online tonight, normally a private consultation will be, okay, set them up, do a questionnaire, do the initial session, and then maybe a handful of follow-ups. Do you get that opportunity with the players to go in deep?
I definitely have it in the sense that management is so supportive and encouraging. I am beyond lucky because, not every dietitian can say that on his or her team. But now if the player is interested or not is really the whole issue. I mean, yes, if they're motivated and they're ready to go, I have everything at my fingertips. We have the resources. And that's exactly how it would go. But some of these guys are just kind of like, yeah, nah, I'm fine. I'm good. But you can see them falling apart. You can see they're exhausted. You can see their faces full of acne, right? They maybe don't go to the bathroom every day, or hair is thinning or whatever. I mean, as a clinician, we view things so differently, but they just think, I'm an athlete. I'm busy. I'm fine. Like, still making shots. It's okay. When really we know there's so much more room for improvement. So sometimes when it's really bad, when I can really see that someone is suffering and they don't necessarily see it, I might say, hey, I noticed you felt this way, or you looked this way, or this happened in the game last night. If we had the opportunity to dig deeper and potentially improve this issue, would you maybe be interested? Versus like, hey, I can order all this testing. Like, do you want a nutrition revamp? Do you want me to go over your food recall? And not that anyone would ever approach it like that. I'm exaggerating, but helping them connect the dots is oftentimes how I can kind of get the buy-in to start ordering the testing and having the formal assessments.
So when you do have somebody who maybe is a bit overtrained or got some gut issues or recurrent infections, and they're starting to think, oh, hey, my buddy saw Kylene recently and seems to be doing better. Okay, let's have a look. What do you do with them? What's your process that you would take them through?
So we would meet. Now, if it's a private client, right, it's easy to sit there for an hour, but you can't necessarily do this when a bunch of people are grabbing at the professional athletes, whether it's trainers, whether it's media, like there's always someone in their face, which is a big challenge. So you want to make sure it's the right time. Maybe when they're sitting there at breakfast, I might sit down and actually almost do an assessment when they're on a treatment table or something similar. So we'll go through probably what most would go through an assessment, right? What are your goals? How are you feeling? Past medical history, medication, supplements, the usual. And then based off of that, and mainly based on what they're hoping to accomplish, I will then either make nutrition tweaks just with diet alone. Sometimes that's just where you have to start. Even though you want to do 10 different things, it's just too overwhelming, and then you will lose them from the start. But some are ready to go. Hey, I've never had this kind of help before. You're who I've been looking for. Let's order everything, right? So depends. I might be ordering 3 tests. I might be working on nothing but, limiting added sugar. But that's where we start, and we continually progress. And once you get that buy-in, once like, hey, my joints don't hurt as much when I removed the fast food 4 times a week, then the rapport is there, the trust is there. And then maybe the next month, like, hey, what do you think about that stool test I mentioned a while ago? Would you be open to putting a little magic in a container for me? And then sometimes at that point, the ball's rolling, we're moving forward, we're going. And then of course, a plan is made based off of results.
Excellent. And do you have pretty much whatever budget you want per player?
Yes, for the most part.
So you could just go out and order 3 big functional tests for them.
Within reason, of course. I never abuse the privileges, and I try to be very respectful and do what makes sense. But yes.
Yeah, that's cool. I've done the odd, teamwork. And there's always this budget that you just can't step over.
Yes.
So I'm going to ask a question and then lead into a couple of ones Paula's asked. One is your interaction with coaches, main coaches, strength and conditioning, physios, other personnel that work with the athletes towards their overall health and performance. Do you interact much with, let's say, the coach saying, okay, player A is looking a bit fatigued. Kylene, can you go and do some work with them? Or do you have team meetings around the players? How does that interaction of a team, in a team context work for you?
It's a great question. So we do actually have a platform where we communicate every week. We kind of put our updates in every week so everyone can see it, but it's more of quick side conversations like, hey, he looked like this today, or hey, I heard this is kind of happening. I want you to be in the loop. Would you mind sitting with him or kind of working on this, or calling his chef at home? So it's more quick conversations, but our staff is great and we get along very well. And that, that isn't always the case depending on the organization. So I feel extremely fortunate. And our head of strength and conditioning, we have the exact same food philosophy, which is just so unbelievably helpful. I can't even explain it to you. Just having someone that believes in it, is on the same page, and doesn't think, this is crazy hogwash, or, who cares if they go to McDonald's, like they'll be fine. because that is the old school approach, and many still feel that way, and that's okay. I just don't know that it's the best answer. And because our team believes in it, there is constant communication and there's so much support, especially on the road when I can't travel.
So that feeds into the next question, which Paul asked, and it's something I certainly found in my occasional interaction with South African football teams, and it's certainly been like that. Football, as in soccer, as you would call it, and it's certainly been that way in the UK as well until quite recently. Paul's asking, in the team context, do you ever butt heads with other coaches or advisors? You know, you mentioned the S&C coach, you're on the same wavelength.
Yes.
Do you irritate anyone in the team?
Well, that's a good question. And you know what, if I do, they haven't let me know yet, but our coaching staff, this sounds crazy. It sounds like I'm making this up, but our actual coaching staff of basketball coaches, they love this. They believe in it. They ask questions for themselves. And I think sometimes because they're interested in their own nutrition and we make some tweaks there and they see how much better they feel and they appreciate the support, that then it's easier for them to say like, hey, this is great. Help my player out, you know, or this guy needs this. But it's not always like that. I just feel like right now in this, maybe the stars are aligning right now in this moment in time. We have incredible support. In the past, oh no, there are coaches that thought it was crazy and thought it was stupid, and they just don't really listen to what you have to say. They don't support it. Maybe they even walk out of the room when you make a suggestion. But right now in this moment, and a lot of our coaches were former players, former athletes. So it's a different wave. It's a different generation than it was when I first started doing this, 12, 13 years ago. These coaches are a little bit more progressive and they had to kind of deal with it themselves. So I'm not sure if that really was a helpful answer.
Yeah. I mean,
It's a truthful answer.
I think, I mean, in many respects, what happens in the US, Europe follows sometime after. So when you first entered and you'd maybe get some resistance to nutrition, we certainly get that to a point. So it's good to know that the wheel is turning and people are starting to realize that it has a big benefit.
And also just, and one more, I don't mean to cut you off, but one more point to that, because I have run in those situations years ago. And at that point, right, it's uncomfortable, but what do you do? Instead of trying to jam it down their throat, I would suggest saying like, hey, you realize it's not normal that this player needs NSAIDs every single day to get through a workout. Like, I know maybe this is what you're accustomed to, but this is actually not normal. This guy is this girl is totally inflamed, and we can do a few basic things, nothing crazy or advanced to address this. And when you explain that what they're seeing and what they're and what your work, how your work can benefit them on the court or in the weight room or on the field, or put the ball in their court, pun intended, show how your work will improve what they are doing and will make their job easier. And that is how I got through when this was an issue earlier in my career.
Yeah, it's really good you're also working with the support staff, because that's a really good way of demonstrating that how we work as professionals. Okay, a question from Florent. Kylene, do you see any change of behaviors or expectations with the new generation arriving in your squad?
Sure. I do think it's better than it was years ago, a little more nutrition forward. I mean, still, for the most part, the rookies are kind of, they're starry-eyed, they're still feeling good, they're still invincible, and they believe that. So while it's better than it was maybe 10 years ago, I mean, you're still dealing with a lot of habits and a lot of cultural things that have been there since childhood. So yes and no. Is it better? Yes, but is it we're not like having cigars and hot dogs before the game as many as, I mean, that was a thing back in the day in the NBA, but now it's not like that. But they're still probably going to choose fried chicken, French fries, and some fruit snacks when they can.
Okay, from Paul, do you ever need to win over a team alpha male or a female to influence the whole squad? Is there a dynamic there?
Yes. And for any of you in the situation that you feel like you're struggling, my suggestion would be to go for the veteran, the one who cares about his body, or the one that has to care because he's exhausted and he's been in the league for too long. Not too long, but he's in the league for so long that he's falling apart a little bit. It's the nature of the business, right? So targeting that individual and saying, let me help you. This is how we're going to do it. This is how I'm going to support you. And then when the guys in the locker room, the girls in the locker room see that individual maybe making changes or feeling better, oftentimes that is how I can get my rookies to kind of follow suit.
Nice. All right, Sebastian, this is the guy who works for the European basketball team. How do you deal with the influence from social media, etc., where professional players might get dubious nutrition advice from, or which they are totally convinced? Good
Yes.
question. How do you
Oh,
compete?
great question. Now that's probably at an all-time high. That's probably worse than ever, right? With all the platforms that are out there and everything that's coming out and everyone trying to make a buck. Yes. So I'm sure everyone has their own approach, but step one here, I never ever completely, even if it's as long as they're safe, even if it's the worst idea ever, I never completely tear it apart ever. I just say, tell me a little bit more about that, or what about it interests you, or show me the article, show me the post. What is it that you're hoping to achieve by maybe following this approach? And as long as it's not a complete disaster, I might say, all right, what if we kind of dabble in this in the off season? What if we take parts of this approach that makes sense for you, and let's play around with it in the off season to see how you feel, versus saying, "Oh no, that's terrible. That's garbage. You're gonna end up blowing out a kidney," right? I mean, right? I'm joking a little bit, but some of the stuff that's out there, these crazy cleanses and things that are not regulated, I mean, it is scary, and they could be at harm. So if that's the case, I explained the danger and why it could be dangerous and what could happen to them. If it's something like keto, for example, where maybe it's not the best fit in the middle of the season, depending on your sport, depending on what you're doing, instead of ripping it apart, I might say, someone asked me this last week, by the way, one of the players, I said, all right, we can play around with this in the off season, but we need to make sure that your calories are meeting your energy, your demands. And we're not going to be eating piles of lard and bacon. We're going to do maybe more of a heavier plant-based keto where we focus on olive oil and avocados and things like that, right? Where you're kind of listening to them, but you're not putting them in harm's way.
So let's follow your keto example for a minute. How do you personalize that? Because the reason for my question is I've met so many different types of athletes. I would tend to deal more with endurance athletes, and some would really do well on a low carb approach, potentially even keto, whereas others would just be, quote, bonking, left and right. Yes. Bonking, by the way, guys, is a cycling term for hitting the wall and running low in glycogen, as opposed to the other kind of bonking. So how would you deal with that? If somebody approaches you, how do you determine, okay, if it's going to be effective for that person?
Sure. Oh, that's tricky. And not that I'm out here saying, we're pushing keto. I don't mean that by any means, but you're right, Ian. Like sometimes depending on the part of the season that we're in and the athlete and their health history as well, it may make sense to be lower carb, and you're right. So, I mean, you're using functional nutrition approach, which means you're getting to know the person, their training demands, their medical history, right? Body size, body composition. I'm going to go a little bit higher carb, even though it's low carb, I'm going higher on a larger male or someone that's more of an endurance athlete than a sprinter or a basketball player. So, and food choices too, depending on preferences and medical history. And if there's a strong family history of diabetes, metabolic syndrome, then I'm more inclined to do something like that in the off season. But that's just it. You're personalizing it based on medical history, training demands, and I guess as well their flavor profile and what they have available to them, right? You can't recommend all this fancy MCT oil and all these crazy products for a college athlete on an extreme budget. So it's really knowing your audience and tweaking it just like you would for any of your clients.
So running on from that, Sally's asking, do you do any form of genetic testing?
No, not really. Rarely. I mean, sometimes in my private practice, if I really feel like I'm not making a headway with the basic tests, but I usually don't have to go that far down the line. It's usually not a favorite choice in the NBA, collecting that type of data. Not preferred.
So okay. I can understand that. That's quite a big one, the ethics around it.
Yes.
Are you okay to share one or two of your kind of favorite functional tests that you do with athletes?
Sure. I don't see anything wrong with that. My gold standard is Diagnostic Solutions. GI map is what I use for stool. I just feel like across the board, like that is the bread, whether you have maybe maybe you know this, maybe you don't. I'm not sure if our clinicians here are new to this, but it is very possible to have disastrous results on a stool test with zero gastrointestinal issues. Like, you don't have to be pooping your pants in public with severe bloating to need a stool test. Like, chronic fatigue, chronic skin issues potentially could be enough to warrant an advanced stool testing. So just let that be known. So that is often where I start, whether they have gut issues or not. I tend to find the most reliable information in there, most helpful information. You said multiple tests, micronutrient testing, of course, right? There's tons of companies. There's Genova, there's Vibrant. I mean, that across the board, I'm sure many of you are doing that. Of course, that's really helpful in this field. I would say those are my top two. But interesting, just a fun fact, just coming from functional medicine at Cleveland Clinic, one of my random specialties is mold exposure. So I do in my private practice a decent amount of mycotoxin testing.
And you mentioned micronutrient testing. What do you go for? Is it organic acids or more blood testing?
It's more just basic blood testing of all vitamins, minerals, amino acids.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
We have the ability to order organic acids, but I usually just start surface level.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Paul's asking, leading on from Sebastian's question, do you have athletes asked to endorse products that you totally disagree with?
Good question.
Since they're such stars, yes, it's a valid question. What are they asked to take?
Oh, I mean, I'm certainly not, I can't name names, of course, but there's certainly someone I work with that is a household name that, often has his face on products that that we would never recommend as clinicians. But I don't have any say in that. I can't, I mean, you just got to let it be. At least in my world, I can't do anything about that, but it happens.
I believe so a lot of the top cyclists will endorse a product but then have something else in their bottle.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think that's across any professional sport.
Okay, do you see any recurring issues with your athletes due to the nature or the intensity of the sports they compete in?
Sure. Well, the biggest issue for us in the NBA is sleep. Not only because our games are back to back, different time zones, like also social media, right? Looking at people are saying about them till 4:00 in the morning, or just whatever happens on the road happens on the road. And so because of that, because of the sleep and the wear and tear, we do see recurrent injuries, right? A lot of I'm not saying that sleep directly relates to ankle injuries, right? But very commonly in basketball, we see a lot of that, a lot of issues with knees, right? So, but as a functional practitioner, if you just work to get to the root and keep inflammation at bay, whatever they're genetically predisposed to, you can kind of take the edge off it and kind of try to prevent if they're willing to work with you on that.
What would you say? You're seeing recurrent injuries and you've assessed that there's definitely inflammatory responses, and maybe you've done a GI map and understand gastrointestinal inflammatory issues. What else would you do from a nutritional perspective? What are your favorite food and supplement kind of options for inflammation and injury?
Yes. And it's rare that I wouldn't find something in the stool, usually in that scenario, but I do a lot of really good quality turmeric and tart cherry, right, in capsule form. Now, of course, we can all incorporate it in diet, but at this level, I just find that I wish nutrition alone was enough, but the wear and tear, the demands, supplementation is a big part. So for sure, I use a lot of that. Of course, a lot goes into the smoothies. We have a company here in the US. By the way, no financial compensation for this, but Athletic Greens is something that is really nice. It's quick, it's easy, it's one size fits all. All they have to do is drink it. So for the guys that hate swallowing pills, they don't want a bunch of pills, they don't want a bunch of creams and this and that. That is kind of like my one-stop shop that I use to kind of cover so many bases when these guys don't really want to do much. So those are kind of my go-tos. Of course, then you're going on a micronutrient testing, but really truly though, if there are recurrent issues and I can't find something in stool or in micronutrients, basic blood work, then I'm diving into toxic exposure. Like, what are you living in? Has there been water damage in you're living in a downtown apartment. A lot of these buildings in Cleveland are much older. They've been renovated, but what was underneath was not necessarily addressed. So I have a lot of people, private clients and professional athletes, who do not feel well when they move into a certain building or a certain environment. So, and basic things that I feel like practitioners neglect, like plugins and air fresheners and the lotions and things they're putting on their body, that toxic burden is a problem if someone is already predisposed to a lot of these issues. So that is the path I will actually start going down if I can't put my finger on something with the basic testing.
And I'm going to ask you the question that stuck on the blurb for this talk as well, which I haven't quite got to yet with all these questions coming in. What's the biggest challenge or challenges that you've encountered working with a pro basketball team?
Sure, it's a great question. And I guess I kind of already said it, but the fact that we are in a unique situation where our leadership, our management is so supportive and so progressive and willing to do whatever a player needs to feel better, to recover faster. But the player themselves, like, it's the one time in my career, I've worked everywhere, right? High school, youth, collegiate, weekend warriors, I've done everything. And this is the one spot in my career where budget is not an issue. The support is there, but the players don't necessarily, maybe don't always believe in it yet, or maybe aren't quite interested. So that is sometimes the biggest challenge. They eventually come around, but at first, sometimes when you want to get going and do all kinds of things, it's not always possible.
Yeah, Sebastian's asking, what's your most frequent first intervention you use with your NBA players to fix those common occurring issues, gut inflammation, etc.?
Right off the bat, usually it's some form of, I hate to use the word elimination diet, but it's just easier to explain it that way. Nothing extreme, but just removing a lot of the inflammatory agents, as I'm sure many of you know. In the United States, our manufacturing, our farming practices aren't necessarily maybe what they should be, what Europe's standards blow us out of the water for the most part. So sometimes foods that are traditionally touted as healthy and strongly encouraged for athletes maybe aren't the best choice, or maybe the sources they're getting it from is not the best. So I always start there, right? You got to run a comb through the diet first before you start ordering all this, testing and supplements. And sometimes we jump the gun. And so that is always the first line of defense. And many times that's all they need. And they feel well enough to keep going, keep buying into it.
Yeah, that's the base of my pyramid, is seasonal, organic, nature-made foods. And it's getting harder to find the authentic food. But in a sense, it's also getting easier because it's becoming more transparent. So are you finding that in the US, that there's more organic box schemes and organic shops and biodynamic options and so on?
It's certainly getting better. I feel like we're kind of turning a corner here, and I'm thankful for that, right? And we live in Ohio, which might mean nothing to some of you, but it's northern part of the United States, and we tend to have a lot of farms around here, which is great because I often have my pick of the litter of local farmers if I need it. Yeah, we actually have one of the best farmers in the world. Like, he actually ships vegetables all over the world. It's Farmer Lee Jones. It's called the Culinary Vegetable Institute. The Chef's Garden is the name of the farm, but they ship vegetables all over the world. They're grown sustainably. They're unbelievable, the taste, the color. So it's kind of a miracle that that's in our backyard. So I use that when I can. And by the way, if you feel like you're stuck, or there's a low budget issue, keeping a food and symptom journal, not just food journal, symptom journal. The athlete will often find that he or she can figure out their own patterns. Like, oh, wow, whenever I eat this sandwich or from this restaurant or from whatever, I feel like garbage. But they don't necessarily know it until they write it out and lay it out themselves. And sometimes they can kind of do the hard work for you.
Do you try and coach them in that way? That mindful connection between their body and their food choices?
Yes. Like, I feel like that's kind of, if I were to give a TED talk, or if I had a platform to stand on, that's kind of that's my go-to is, you shouldn't want to nap every day after lunch, right? You shouldn't have crazy gas after every meal. Like, I know you think maybe that's just a part of being a human, but it's actually not. So here's what we can maybe look at to change it.
Yeah, I mean, my practice the last 10 years has been mindful connection, mindful eating, mindful living. Okay, so Paul was asking about blood work. Are you happy to share a few of the sort of key markers that you would look at what a sort of standard panel would be that you'd order?
So, and I'm looking at different markers for different athletes, but that's the whole beauty of functional nutrition, right? Nothing is cookie cutter, nothing is standard. Of course, the basics are always there, right? You're looking at ferritin, looking at vitamin D, vitamin C, antioxidants. I think antioxidants are big. Glutathione is often kind of an interesting one that I think a lot of us don't hit, right? When that's depleted, shouldn't be. There's usually a sign that we're plowing through that for some reason. Of course, amino acids, depending on the athlete. But I really do a lot of blood work actually, it's actually a urine test in the terms of toxic exposure, right? Mold, heavy metals. I had someone 2 weeks ago, private practice, who was an avid athlete, suddenly became very sick out of nowhere in his late 30s. His doctor said his kidneys were failing. Like, none of this made sense. Like, none of it made sense. So I thought, okay, like, fine, we'll look at basic micronutrients. But I dove into a toxic element profile, and I found that he was swimming in, it was this strange fertilizer that he had been using on his crops in his garden, and he'd been using it for years. Wasn't glyphosate. It was something that I wasn't necessarily familiar with, but it was, I think it was a weed killer. And so that was more important. Finding that was more important than any stool test, than any micronutrient panel. And so kind of trying to get that out is what is currently changing this man's life. So that was a long-winded answer for, I don't have a standard go-to. It's different for every person that comes to me.
And if you find toxicity, do you go down the line of far infrared saunas and these sort of strategies?
You got it.
And can you do that within the basketball center, or is that more private?
I usually don't. And a lot of these guys usually don't need to go that extreme. That's more my private practice. If we do, we'll do it in the off season, and we'll usually do it from an outside. A lot of these guys go back home too. So I'm working on figuring out what they need in their respective cities.
Yeah. Okay. So tell us about the private chef that they'll have at home. Well, let's start with the chefs in the actual center first. I mean, what are you recommending to them? Presumably it's a sort of two-way street and a regular interaction. What are you trying to get the chefs to do?
So I know everyone has their own approach, but basically finding what that athlete loves, whether it's chicken sandwiches, whether it's Mexican power bowls, whatever, and finding out what they gravitate towards, and then how I can speak to our chefs to have better quality sauce, better homemade breadcrumbs made from, we throw a little flax in there, or whatever. One of our chefs makes this awesome avocado, chocolate peanut butter pudding. It's like a parfait, but the whole base is avocado, right? We don't need to announce that necessarily, as long as it tastes good and looks good, right? So kind of it's almost like, it's kind of fun. It's like working with young children in a way, right? Where you're kind of, when your kids are little and you're trying to disguise things, lacing in nutrient dense food into a food that they can't wait to eat is really the whole balance of the game. And it doesn't always work perfectly, but we have a system going. We have a great group and doing the best we can.
What's your personal favorite food? Let's say treat food, because you mentioned there like the chocolate pudding that's avocado based, which I've experienced similar. And it's delicious.
Right.
But
So good.
You feel like you're having a treat, but every single ingredient is actually very good for you.
Your blood sugar is stable. Everybody wins.
So what's your favorites? What's your treats?
That's a good question. I'm a fan of really, really good chocolate for sure. But one of our chefs makes this awesome pretzel crusted chicken. It's like one of my favorite things on the planet.
Excellent. And do a lot of the players enjoy fish? I mean,
They
obviously bringing in the omega-3s.
Yes, a lot of the guys like salmon, which is very nice. We have if anything smells really crazy or looks really crazy, we're probably not going to go down that path. But we know that, right? And I know not to put sea bass on an airplane, right? Everyone starts gagging. You got to kind of know what you're working with. And if I'm going to introduce something new type of fish or anything in that family, of course we will pair it with a sauce that they love, or like a garnish or a type of breading that they love. So that way it's like, okay, this isn't too foreign. And then once they get their little toes wet, it's like, okay, let's keep going.
So it's like working with grown-up kids.
Right.
Finding something they enjoy and just gradually leading them
Yeah.
in another direction.
Right.
Right, Sebastian's asking, have you ever suggested to an NBA player to end working together and asked him to come back the day he's really motivated if you feel it's a waste of time? Or would that be too risky to do regarding your position in the club?
Sure. Well, I'm there full time. I'm in the trenches day in and day out. So it's not, it's not like I'm a hired outside consultant where someone brought me in to help a player who was like, no, thank you. In that case, sure, that approach would make sense. But because I'm there all day, every day, and working with everybody, it's more of just you don't harp on this player. You don't try to meet with this player until maybe they're ready to come to you or they come to ask you like, hey, you know what? You mentioned this a few months ago. Let's just try it. I might wait for them to come back to me versus firing them, so to speak. I would not do that. No.
Okay, so everyone in the audience, any questions you want to put in front of Kylene, start firing them in. I had one in my head that has just looped around. Yes. What top tips as an experienced team sport dietitian would you have for somebody working professionally as a nutritional practitioner in a team environment? What are the kind of key things that might be different between a team environment compared to individual kind of solo athletes?
Well, the tricky part about it is that you're helping a large group with a multitude of needs, and you're there because it's just kind of part of the pro sport experience. They didn't necessarily hire you individually. It's not money out of their own pocket, so to speak, to get your help. So the buy-in is different, your approach is different. And I think you have to become good at knowing your audience and knowing your place and what you're trying to accomplish, and also knowing that Rome wasn't built in a day. And I would say the other part of that is, maybe to make yourself stand out or maybe to make progress a little faster, is always know the why and explain the why behind what you're doing. Don't just put signs up around the facility about vitamin D being so great. Like, why is it great? What is it going to improve? What is it doing for them? If you want them to try this food, well, why? Don't just say, well, it's healthy, it's low fat. I mean, why? What's it going to do? Is it going to help repopulate their microbiome? Is it going to, is it high in magnesium? It's going to help his headache or headaches, right? Explaining the why and taking it from that standpoint not only shows that you know what you're talking about and you have the knowledge, but it helps with buy-in. And at the end of the day, that is what you need to succeed in any area of functional nutrition, no matter where your interests lie.
So it sounds like a real strength that you have is because you're there every day, you've got the time to interact with them. So that's really nice compared to, let's say, individual consultation.
Mm-hmm.
Although we're interacting with people who have chosen to come and pay us to have those set of sessions. So yeah, just different, eh?
Pros and cons, totally different. Pros and cons, yes.
Okay, Togo, who's a cyclist. What are the top 5 tips you have found made the biggest impact for elite athletes in terms of performance? Okay, so that's a big question. Any that come to mind?
And that's kind of tricky too, right? Like, what path do you go down to answer that question? Just getting to know the individual. That answers everything, because maybe they want to do this, and this, these are their goals, but they can't swallow pills, or they are allergic to this, or they hate this. It's like, sure, I could give you 12 things this athlete should be doing, but you have to know them to know that maybe what you would like to do or what should be done is not going to work. So that's not a helpful answer. That's a tricky question because it's not the same across the board. But I would say in my world, right, getting recipes down with the chefs that actually look good and taste good is important across the board. Finding a supplement regimen, supplements that actually work. It's one thing to be legal for sport, but like, does it actually work? Because no one's going to keep swallowing capsules if it's not doing anything for them. Like, what? And then you look like an idiot, right? So finding just a route, like 3 to 5 supplements that are great, helpful for sport, that actually work, and that that are easy to take, that aren't disgusting, is huge. Those are my top 2. Those are my top 2 that would go across the board. The rest would be probably completely different for each person.
I think the first one you were talking about is kind of like a personalization. So yeah, it's not across the board, but you have to understand your athlete, which is really important. So Togo's following up by saying, is it more education than with athletes? And
Yes.
I'll add in a question as well. Do you do like workshops or presentations or any sort of educational things on a regular basis?
I definitely do in the community and more on for the private practice side, I do quite often, but not, I mean, in the NBA, I'm not gathering everyone around and chatting about things because it's just different for each player. They have different needs, different goals, different interests. We're no longer at that. This is what a fat is. And this, I mean, that's not, you're going to lose them right away. You can't really do that. So maybe a little bit with the G League, we might, right? Those are our guys we're trying to develop, but no, not as much team. Now at the college level, tons of presentation. Before I came to the NBA, I worked with many of the local colleges. I would go in weekly to do the team talks, right? Because they're all in the same playing field, right? They're eating from the same cafeterias. They're coming from the same budget. So it was really easy. And they all had similar issues at that point. So the team talks, yes. But regardless of what you're doing or who you're working with, education is the foundation of everything. Because if they don't understand the message that you are trying to relay, who's going to follow anything you recommend? If it doesn't make sense, or they think they feel fine regardless, you're almost wasting your time.
Yeah, the proof is in the pudding. And you said something earlier that's really, really important. It's building trust. Doesn't matter who you're working with. You need to, if you go in there all guns a-blazing with big tests and fancy protocols, you'll lose them. But if you figure out what they want, that one thing that could just make them feel a little bit better, and then they're in, they trust you, and then you can add a second thing.
Perfectly said.
Okay, here's a challenging question for you, because it sounds like you're in a situation where you have a amazing budget. But if you were in a situation where you didn't have a budget or didn't have much of a budget, so maybe you need to reverse to when you worked in college teams and stuff, what would be your go-to tests or advice to get the best bang for your buck? So on a lower budget, what would you try and do with each player?
I've actually given presentations just on this topic alone of what to do when you're brand new or there's no budget. And hands down, maybe I'm biased, but like you have to start with the food and symptom journal. There's no way around it. It's free. It's easy. They can do it before they come into you, especially because sometimes in the lower budget settings, a ton of athletes are thrown at you and it's a quick turnover. You can't spend an hour with each of these individuals. So sometimes it's 15 minutes on to the next 15 minutes. They bring the next one in. That's how it used to be when I was working with maybe college football or college track and field. And so the food and symptom journal is number one, hands down, because it's the only way you can draw patterns without spending a dime. And then based on that, depending on what I saw, we would recommend food changes. Always start with food changes, right? Maybe it's something as simple as we're pulling this or we're adding this. And if it's a really serious issue and it's very clear to me, I will actually go to the athletic trainer or the head of performance, wherever we are. Would you be open to purchasing this supplement, or could you put me in contact with the parents? I mean, we could help get through if something is really wrong. But that is where I start when there's minimal budget. And then if you really need to, if someone is very sick and they're a college athlete and if something happened, then that's when we rope in the parents, or perhaps I try to find a company that's willing to accept insurance for the stool test or whatnot.
Togo is asking, do you have general guidelines that vary by position? Which is quite an interesting question, because if you open a sports nutrition textbook, you often get nutrition varied by sport, which I find quite amusing because it's not personalized to the person.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, you just said it. That's exactly it. I feel like that was that was how I was taught to approach it. Specific guidelines for position or for sport was how I started my career. But now, so far in, it almost doesn't even make sense when you think of it that way, because, I mean, you just said it, Ian. We're also unique. You can't.
Do you use any electrolyte products with your players?
All kinds of stuff. And a lot of them come in with things they already love. And as long as it's not pure junk, we just keep it going. Over here, a lot of guys they love Drip Drop. They love Element. LMNT is how it's spelled out. It's very good. The Right Stuff is another great company. again, I have no affiliations, no financial gains. It's just kind of what's common over here. Those are some of the top ones. For scratch is very popular. A lot of guys like the taste of that. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you've got a lot of choice over there. I think a lot more than we do.
Okay.
Okay, Sebastian's asking, do you work with the elimination diet only with injured players or in the off season or also during the season? So I think a couple of years ago, you presented a webinar on elimination and challenge. So that's a very good question.
Mhm.
So,
And go ahead.
So take a player off a certain number of foods for a few weeks and then reintroduce, and instead of doing food sensitivity testing. So do you do that in the team context as well?
Yes. And not to sound like a broken record, but again, it completely depends on the situation. If someone is really suffering and they don't feel well, and it's day in and day out, we're waking up exhausted or whatever it may be, I might lightly address that in season for sure. But if it's more of just like, I kind of feel blah, I'm curious about this, I'd be open to this, we'll do it in the off season for sure. And we might remove one food, not 6, it just depends. And if they have a chef at home, if the support is there, right, that's different too. Versus if they're on their own, I'm way less likely to start messing around with major food groups.
Okay, so in a clinical situation in your private practice and you got a sick person, you'll do a more hectic elimination challenge.
Yeah, especially if they're either they feel very ill and they want results fast, or the budget is very, very minimal and they can't do the testing, they can't really do anything. For sure, we're going to start with food and kind of do a reintroduction, because sometimes that's the best I can do with the resources that I have.
Yeah, that's cool. Yeah, I agree with you on the athlete point of view. Take them off 1, maybe 2 foods and adjust things. But yeah, it can be a bit overwhelming and it could upset their athletic performance if you meddle too much.
Exactly.
Okay, time for a last couple of questions. We've got one from Paul again. Leading on from Sebastian's question, do you give the players a schedule to follow off season when they're not at the club every day? There's a good one. What do they do when you're not influencing them every day?
Oh man, I can only imagine. Those that I don't force anything. Those that ask, absolutely. I'll plan until the cows come home. If they're interested and they're motivated and they're going to follow it, I will do anything and everything. But for the most part, it's more of I'm checking in on them weekly, bi-weekly, monthly, depending on where they are in the world and what they're doing, making sure they're okay, checking in with their chef if they have one. I'll send supplements if they need them. But it's more of check-ins to make sure you're not completely falling off the rails. Now, some guys, like someone actually came to me 2 weeks ago and said, hey, off season's coming up. Will you sit down with me to make a plan, to maintain my lean muscle mass? Great. Then of course, but I don't ever just make plans and hand them out because I know that they will not be followed.
Right. Okay, so let's round off. Have you got any last tips or summaries that you'd like to share with us?
Just for those of you in the trenches or hoping to be in the trenches, just know that, because this is the number one question I get. Well, why isn't there a manual of what to do? Why can't you just, why aren't there protocols? Why aren't there guidelines? And I mean, to a certain extent, sure, but that's the whole beauty of what we do. That's what makes us unique as practitioners. That's what sets us apart and gives us this unique level of success, is that we don't have specific protocols that you just use across the board. It's more of it's a skill set that you develop, learning how to read the audience and trying a lot of this stuff on yourself. That's another big tip. Always, whether you have health issues or not, always experiment on yourself. The testing, the supplements, the new shake before you ever recommend it. And a lot of people don't do that. And how can you not, right? And just knowing that Rome wasn't built in a day and that there is no standardized textbook that you can use across the board, and nor should there be.
So thank you so much, Kylene. I've really enjoyed this discussion. We've just kind of rolled with it and seen where the conversation went. But along the way, you've shared a lot of good tips and, experiential stuff, some of which is basic, or it should be basic. Based on that last tip you said, there's no protocol. We need to be comfortable,
Yes.
running with it and, pulling from a bigger and bigger toolbox as we get more experienced. So that's a key one. So thank you so much, and good luck with your season, and good luck with baby number 2.
Thank you everyone for the great question. Thank you, Ian. Take care.
Okay, good night. Thanks everyone. We'll see you next month.